In chapter 6, we're going to be focusing on the topic of economic growth and the factors that affect economic growth. So let me share my screen to show the textbook and the particular sections of chapter 6 that we're going to focus on in this chapter. So here is the textbook, the beginning of chapter 6, the introduction, and in terms of the learning outcomes. In particular, we're going to focus on the 6.1 and 6.4. Those are the two sections in chapter 6 that we're going to focus our attention on. So you're not required to read sections 6.2 and 6.3. You certainly can, and to get a better understanding of the material, and even in section 6.1 and 6.4, but we're really going to focus on those two sections. In particular, we're going to spend more time focusing on section 6.1. So in section 6.1, as the introduction discusses here, it gives a number of different countries and the average annual growth rate in those different countries over more than 100-year period, about 150 years. So you can see that in 1870, the UK and Australia are leading the pack in terms of the standard of living, in terms of real GDP per capita, per person, right? So Australia, since then, through 2016, we're at about 1.5%. The UK about 1.3%. But notice that the US is growing at 1.8%. So in 1870, the real GDP per capita in the US is much lower than it is, for example, in the UK and in Australia. So the United States is not the leader of the pack in terms of economic growth, or in terms of the size of their economy or living standards 150 years ago. But by the time we get to 2016, you can see the real GDP per capita out of these 8 countries, these 8 major countries, is highest in the United States. And the UK is significantly further behind. Australia, not quite as much. But you can see why that is if you look at the annual growth rates. The annual growth rate in the UK is 1.3% over that roughly 150 years. It's 1.8% in the United States. It doesn't seem like very big difference, right? Only 0.5% difference per year in the annual growth rate of the economy in terms of the real GDP. But you can see that there's a reversal in terms of the ranking of these two countries over 150 years. And so what's the lesson that we take away from that? Even small differences in growth rates can lead to big differences in standards of living over long periods of time, right? So how fast a country is growing, even a 0.5 percentage point difference can matter over long periods of time in terms of the real standard of living for future generations and the real standard of living for a country relative to other countries over a long period of time. So that's a key important point to take away from this chapter, that changes in growth rates of the real economy have big impacts over time on the standard of living. Of course, we're measuring the standard of living here by real GDP, the amount of goods and services available for people in the economy. It's not the only way one might measure standard of living, but in economics, that's typically our starting point for thinking about that, partly because standards of living measured by real GDP are positively correlated with things like longer lifespans, better health, a whole variety of other economic and personal social indicators. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's correlated with a lot of things that do matter. So let's look at section 6.1. In section 6.1, we're introduced to the notion of growth accounting, right? And it comes from the production function that we learned back in chapter 3. And we can break that production function up into this equation by looking at changes rather than just the levels, right? If this was if we thought about the equation that we have for real GDP, and we took logs and we took the difference in logs, this is what we would get. Or we can think of partial derivatives as well. And so we can translate this equation into this equation using changes rather than levels. So from that, we can see that changes in the level of real GDP are made up of changes in total factor productivity, changes in the growth rate of capital, and changes in the growth rate of labor. And then these are elasticities, so they're less than 1 typically, and they are less than 1, and they represent how important these changes in capital or labor are into contributing to changes in real GDP growth. So you can see there are 3 different factors that come into play when we think about what causes the changes in long run economic growth. So it's kind of like the uses of saving identity in a sense, right? This is not the economic theory, right? But it helps us really understand the things that matter for economic growth. The Solow growth model in this chapter 6.2, section 6.2, is getting into some theory about why this works and why these things matter, and which things matter. 6.3 is a newer kind of growth theory, endogenous growth theory. It tries to take account of some limitations in the Solow growth model, and to have a more optimistic outcome, actually a more optimistic story about long run living standards and the growth in those living standards over time. Right. One of the questions that we have as economists is, will living standards, can they and will they continue to grow over time? And that has to do with these factors here. Are there limits to economic growth? That's a question that one could ask. And if not, what are the things that matter for continuous growth in living standards from one generation to another? So in this section 6.1, we use that equation to think about growth accounting, go through it in detail here in terms of what this means, the factors and the relative weights, essentially, of the contribution of those factors to economic growth. And so we can ultimately come up with a number in terms of what productivity growth is. And then we can think about how all of that leads to economic growth for the whole economy. So we can think about productivity trends over long periods of time. In this case, in this table, we go back to 1929. I'm going to relate this to another piece of reading I want you to look at. It's not long, but it updates these numbers essentially from the Congressional Budget Office. It helps us understand projections about economic growth into the future, not just looking backwards. So you can see the different sources of growth: labor growth, capital growth, total input growth, productivity growth, and how all of those things contribute to overall total growth in real GDP, or total output growth. Okay? Total input growth has to do with these two, labor and capital combined. Productivity growth has to do with total factor productivity, or that A in the production function. So we can do that with actual real GDP, which is what we'll look at in just a moment. It's important to look at the application here, how productivity has changed over time. Productivity turns out to be a key driver of economic growth and living standards for the economy. So that's one of the things that we want to look at. What's happening to productivity growth, in particular in the U.S. Here's a picture of that. We typically see labor productivity growing over time, and growing faster than total factor productivity. Will this continue? Will it sort of flatten out? That's one of the big questions, because as the answer to that question will determine what happens to overall growth in real GDP in the economy. And we can understand what drives productivity growth for labor productivity. You can see in this graph that's one of the key drivers for the economy and economic growth. So what matters for that? And we can use that growth accounting equation to take a look at that in more detail as well. And we can see that capital and labor matter here, as well as total factor productivity growth, right? So we have labor productivity growth. We can break that down. This is what this section of that section 6.1 shows us what we can do. So if we have some make some assumptions and look at some things from empirical evidence about the elasticity of output with respect to labor and to capital, right? We add one assumption in here, and we can talk about changes in real GDP per worker, right? Productivity, in other words, labor productivity, that's this, right, is made up of total factor productivity, things like changes in technology, plus some elasticity term here, right, times the difference between the changes in capital growth and labor growth. Or actually what this means is the change in capital per worker. This change in parentheses is really the change in capital per worker. So what it says is the productivity of labor depends on changes in technology and changes on how much capital each worker has to work with. Right, so we can break it down into those two different components. Right, so understanding this section and how to think about this growth accounting, what it tells us about what to look for, and what kinds of things matter for long-term economic growth, right, is going to be important. The section 6.4. If we jump to that, right, it's the other section of this chapter I want you to pay attention to. Talks about the kinds of things that might be done in terms of government policies that could raise long-run living standards, right? If it's the amount of, as we just were talking about from section 1, if it's the amount of capital per worker and the amount of technology that drives labor productivity, and labor productivity is what drives economic growth, then the things that affect the capital per worker matter. Well, we know back from chapter 4 and chapter 5 that savings rates matter. The amount of saving in the economy matters in terms of how much investment in new capital occurs. And the more saving that there is in the economy, the more investment in new capital, and the more capital workers have to work with. Right? So it's going to increase the capital per worker ratio, which is going to increase labor productivity. But we know that already, actually, back from chapter 3. More capital means a shift up in the aggregate production function, increases the marginal productivity of capital, increases the marginal product of labor. Marginal product of labor is what we're talking about when we're talking about the productivity of labor. So we've seen that before already, right? So nothing new big surprise here. And then, so part of it has to do with raising saving rates to get more capital. The other one has to do with raising productivity growth itself. So one of the things that affects that, infrastructure, right? One of the things we were just talking about on the first exam, something that is being discussed in Congress currently, building human capital, education, right? College education, K-12 education, higher literacy rates in countries, for example, encouraging research and development. All those things lead to more output being produced with the same amount of labor and the same amount of capital, which is what we mean by productivity overall in the economy. So this is one of the things to also pay attention to. This section 6.4, you can see it's relatively short. There's less reading this week in that sense, but it's important that you understand how to work with the information that's in this chapter. To that end, I'm going to share a different reading, and I will make this available to everybody. So let's take a look at the Congressional Budget Office twice a year, at least twice a year. They have a new outlook, a new update on their economic outlook for the economy over the next decade. And this is something I'm going to ask you to be reading along with the material from Chapter 6. It's very similar to what is done in that first part of Chapter 6 in terms of growth accounting. First of all, in this Congressional Budget Office report, there's just part of the reports, the economic report. There's another budget related report. I'll give you a quick look at that in just a moment. But these are the different kinds of variables that they're looking at: inflation rate variables, real GDP, employment, unemployment rate. All of those kinds of things is what they're trying to predict over the next decade. Potential GDP, how close is actual real GDP to potential GDP in terms of, in this case, percentage change? What's happening, or how fast do we expect the actual potential of the economy, the full employment level of real GDP to increase? How, in other words, in terms of our model, how quickly do we think that production function is going to shift upward due to more capital, due to more labor productivity, due to newer technologies, et cetera? And then how fast does actual real GDP grow relative to real potential GDP? You can see that there was a big drop in real GDP, right, because of the pandemic during 2020. And so what's the projection for next year, right? And that's expected to grow faster. Then you can see that the real potential GDP growth, potential GDP, full employment GDP, doesn't change because of changes in the business cycle, but actual real GDP certainly does. So we were way below potential GDP throughout 2020, right? And that's what this is showing as well: percentage of potential GDP, and what is the output gap. And this is the projected past this dashed line over the next decade. What's the projected output gap, right? You can see there was a big negative output gap in 2020 due to the pandemic. We had come out, probably we were close to full employment over the past 3 years, and maybe even beyond full employment is what this says. The output gap was positive, right? So we were more than, we were higher. Actual GDP, real GDP, was higher than potential GDP over the previous 3 years or so, right? And you can see we're slowly getting back to potential real GDP, right, from the last recession, right, 2008, 2009, and then slowly closing the gap to full employment, okay? So, well, one of the things we can look at, right, over time is what's going to happen to real GDP, right, over time, the projected growth in those different areas, right? C plus I plus G plus net exports, right? In each one of those areas, and we can also look at, and this is what's important for us in Chapter 6, is real potential GDP. This is the actual long-run growth of real GDP that we're talking about. What is going to affect the real potential GDP, the long-run growth of real GDP in the economy? And you can see that it goes in chunks of time in terms of the average annual growth. And then we can talk about it, in this case, over the whole period from 1950 to 2020, right? So these are the components in terms of time. And here's the total average annual growth rate, right? So real potential GDP has grown at about 3.1% over the last 70 years. What's the expectation over the next 10, right? About 1.8%, right? Quite a bit less, right? So that's a big difference. That's a big difference, okay? What about the labor force productivity, right? That's one way you can think about this. What are the contributions to the growth of real potential output, right? This is the growth accounting that we're talking about, right? So how much of it comes from an increase in hours worked, an increase in labor, an increase in capital inputs, and an increase in the total factor productivity. Okay? This is exactly what we were talking about in those growth accounting equations from chapter 6.1, the first section in chapter 6. Right, so these are the total contributions. And then we also have potential labor productivity as well. Right? So this is in particular a table to pay attention to. Let me show you, I'll relate this to the videos for this chapter. There are videos on a simple way to think about economic growth called the Rule of 70. Here's a video on the real GDP growth accounting that we were just talking about. And then growth projections in the US. This table, this is a video on not on the current table that we were just looking at, but it is a table from a previous period. And so there's a discussion about how to actually understand that table and relate it back to the first section in chapter 6. So that should give you a good overview of the chapter, relating it to what's in the textbook, and also how it's related to this most recent Congressional Budget Office publication, which came out in February. Right, this is that table we're talking about. So one of your goals is to really think about how does this relate to that growth accounting equation that we saw in the first section of chapter 6. And you'll see that also in a homework question.